They called her Sister Maria, a quiet nun who heard confessions in the world's most secure prison. But when the guards brought in the man they called the Shadow, the terrorist responsible for 17 bombings across 3 continents, they had no idea they were placing the world's most dangerous criminal face to face with the one person who had been hunting him for over a decade. The morning fog clung to the razor wire surrounding Blackwater Federal Penitentiary like a shroud, casting everything in shades of gray that matched the concrete walls and the souls of the men housed within. Sister Maria Elena Vasquez adjusted her simple black habit and checked her wooden rosary as she walked through the security checkpoint, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floor. To the guards who waved her through, she was just another fixture of the prison's spiritual services department, as unremarkable as the chaplain's office key that hung from her belt. The correctional officers barely glanced up from their paperwork as she passed. After 3 years of twice-weekly visits, she had become invisible to them, blending into the institutional background like the faded motivational posters and safety notices that covered every available wall surface. Her presence was so routine that even the metal detectors seemed to beat more softly for her, as if the machines themselves had grown accustomed to her quiet devotion. "Morning, Sister," Officer Rodriguez called from behind the reinforced glass of the security station. His greeting carried the casual indifference of someone acknowledging a piece of familiar furniture. "Got a full schedule today. 3 confessions before lunch, then that anger management session with the Level C inmates." Sister Maria nodded with the serene patience that had become her trademark among the prison staff. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the gentle authority of someone who had spent years offering comfort to the lost and forgotten. "Thank you, Officer Rodriguez. Has the new transfer arrived yet?" "I believe he's scheduled for spiritual counseling." Rodriguez flipped through a stack of transfer documents, his expression shifting slightly as he found the relevant paperwork. "Yeah, he's here. High security wing, isolation cell. Management's being real careful with this one. Word is he's some kind of international terrorist, real bad news. They're calling him the Shadow because intelligence agencies couldn't track him for years." Sister Maria's expression remained perfectly neutral, showing only the mild interest of someone whose calling required her to minister to all souls, regardless of their crimes. But something flickered behind her dark eyes, gone so quickly that anyone watching might have dismissed it as a trick of the fluorescent lighting. "I see. Has he requested spiritual guidance?" "That's the weird thing," Rodriguez continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Guy hasn't said a word since they brought him in yesterday. Not to the interrogators, not to the psychologists, not even to demand a lawyer. Just sits there staring at the wall like he's waiting for something. But the warden figured maybe you could get through to him. You've got that way with the hard cases." The observation was meant as a compliment, but it carried an undertone of puzzlement that Sister Maria had grown accustomed to over her years of service. The guards and administrative staff couldn't quite understand how the quiet nun managed to reach inmates that seasoned counselors and hardened interrogators had given up on. They attributed it to faith, to divine intervention, to the mysterious ways that spirituality could touch even the most hardened hearts. What they didn't see was the way she analyzed every gesture, every micro-expression, every carefully chosen word. They didn't notice how she positioned herself in rooms to maintain sightlines and exit routes, or how her eyes automatically cataloged potential weapons and defensive positions. They couldn't recognize the subtle techniques she used to build rapport and extract information, methods that had nothing to do with religious training and everything to do with skills learned in places where reading people correctly meant the difference between completing a mission and never coming home. Sister Maria's journey to Blackwater had begun 4 years earlier, when a car accident had left her with a severe limp and ended her career in what the personnel files listed as international humanitarian work. The official story, stamped and filed in the appropriate bureaucratic channels, described the aid worker whose injuries had forced her to seek a quieter calling in religious service. The church had welcomed her with open arms, providing the credentials and cover she needed to begin a new life dedicated to spiritual counsel and rehabilitation. The truth was considerably more complex. The woman who now carried rosary beads had once carried weapons in places that didn't appear on most maps. She had spoken a dozen languages fluently and understood the psychological profiles of terrorists, insurgents, and war criminals with an expertise that had made her invaluable to operations that officially didn't exist. Her limp was real, the result of shrapnel from an explosion in a safe house outside Damascus. But the injury that had truly ended her previous career was psychological, not physical. She had simply grown tired of the shadows, of the endless cycle of violence that defined the world of international intelligence and counter-terrorism. When the opportunity arose to disappear into a life of genuine service, she had taken it without hesitation, trading her government clearance for a nun's habit and her encrypted communications for prayer books. But old skills don't disappear just because you put on different clothes. The ability to read micro-expressions remains sharp even when you're counseling petty thieves instead of interrogating arms dealers. The knowledge of psychological manipulation techniques doesn't fade when you're using them to help gang members find redemption instead of extracting information from captured terrorists. And the mental database of international criminal networks and terrorist organizations stays current even when you're supposed to be focused on matters of faith and salvation. As Sister Maria walked through the corridors of Blackwater Federal Penitentiary that morning, she appeared to be nothing more than a dedicated religious worker preparing for another day of spiritual counseling. Her demeanor was calm, her pace unhurried. Her focus apparently centered on the pastoral care she would provide to men who had lost their way. But beneath the surface, a different kind of preparation was taking place, as instincts and skills that had been dormant for years began to stir in response to a name. She knew better than any prayer. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The labyrinthine bureaucracy of federal prison administration had turned what should have been a simple pastoral visit into an exercise in regulatory compliance that would have challenged a team of lawyers. Sister Maria stood in the anteroom outside Warden Patricia Hawkins' office, clutching a manila folder thick with forms that documented every aspect of her proposed spiritual counseling session with the new high-security transfer. Each page bore multiple signatures, stamps, and approval codes that testified to the exhaustive review process required for any interaction with what the Department of Justice had classified as an extreme-risk national security detainee. The waiting area buzzed with the quiet efficiency of middle management, where assistant wardens and administrative coordinators moved between cubicles carrying additional paperwork that would need to be filed, reviewed, and approved before any meaningful action could take place. The walls were covered with organizational charts that mapped the complex hierarchy of approvals required for everything from dietary modifications to library privileges, creating a visual representation of how institutional protocol could strangle common sense with procedural red tape. Sister Maria, a young woman in a crisp business suit, approached with the harried expression of someone who spent her days navigating competing federal mandates. "I'm Deputy Warden Sarah Chun. I've been reviewing your request for spiritual counseling access to the new transfer, and I'm afraid we've encountered some complications." Sister Maria rose with the patient grace that had become second nature during her years of institutional service, but her trained eye automatically cataloged the tension in Chun's posture, the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of stress. Beyond normal administrative pressures. "What kind of complications, Deputy Warden?" I understood that spiritual counseling was considered a fundamental right under federal incarceration guidelines. Chun gestured toward a conference room where 3 other officials were. Already seated around a table covered with thick binders and laptop computers, displaying what appeared to be classified briefing documents. Under normal circumstances, yes. But this particular detainee has been flagged by multiple federal agencies as requiring special handling protocols. The FBI wants to maintain psychological pressure through isolation. The CIA is concerned about information security. The Department of Homeland Security has classified him as a continuing domestic threat even while incarcerated. The conference room carried the sterile atmosphere of government meetings where important decisions were made by people who would never face the consequences of those decisions. Sister Maria took her assigned seat at the far end of the table, noting how the arrangement positioned her as a supplicant rather than a participant in the discussion that would determine whether she could perform the basic functions of her ostensible calling. "Sister," began Agent Marcus Webb, whose FBI credentials hung from a lanyard that marked him as someone accustomed to having his authority acknowledged without question. "We appreciate your dedication to providing spiritual guidance to the incarcerated population. However, this particular individual presents unique security concerns that supersede normal pastoral care protocols." Agent Webb opened a briefcase and withdrew a tablet displaying what appeared to be a heavily redacted intelligence brief. The visible portions contained photographs of bombing sites, casualty reports, and organizational charts mapping terrorist networks across multiple continents. "The man you want to counsel is responsible for coordinating attacks that killed over 400 civilians. Intelligence agencies have been hunting him for 12 years. We can't risk compromising operational security for what amounts to a routine prison ministry visit." Sister Maria maintained the expression of concerned spiritual guidance that had become her professional mask, but her mind was rapidly processing details that weren't included in the sanitized briefing materials. She recognized some of the bombing signatures from operations she had investigated during her previous career, connections that painted a more complex picture than the simplified narrative being presented. But revealing that knowledge would raise questions about a nun's expertise that could unravel her carefully constructed cover. "I understand your security concerns, Agent Webb," she replied with the calm reasonableness that had diffused countless similar bureaucratic standoffs. "But surely spiritual counseling falls under constitutional protections that supersede agency protocols. Even the most dangerous criminals retain certain fundamental rights." Dr. Jennifer Martinez, whose credentials identified her as a federal prison psychologist, leaned forward with the patronizing patience that mental health professionals sometimes displayed toward religious colleagues they considered well-meaning but naive. "Sister, with respect, this isn't a typical counseling situation. The subject has undergone extensive psychological evaluation since his capture. He shows signs of sophisticated counter-interrogation training and appears to be maintaining operational discipline even while incarcerated. Any interaction could potentially compromise ongoing intelligence operations." The psychologist's assessment triggered recognition patterns that Sister Maria had to consciously suppress. The behavioral profile described classic tradecraft techniques that she had encountered in numerous operational contexts, methods that suggested training by intelligence services rather than simple terrorist indoctrination. But acknowledging that understanding would require explaining expertise that a prison chaplain wasn't supposed to possess. "Dr. Martinez," Sister Maria said carefully, "my role isn't to extract information or compromise security operations. Spiritual counseling focuses on matters of conscience and redemption. Perhaps there's a way to provide pastoral care while maintaining your security requirements." The suggestion prompted an exchange of glances between the federal officials that spoke of prior discussions and predetermined positions. Agent Webb consulted his tablet before responding with the tone of someone delivering a carefully rehearsed decision. "The Department of Justice has established specific protocols for this category of detainee. All interactions must be monitored and recorded. Any conversations must be conducted through reinforced barriers with audio surveillance. The session cannot exceed 30 minutes, and it must be terminated immediately if the subject attempts to communicate anything that could be construed as operational intelligence. Sister Maria nodded with apparent acceptance while internally calculating how impossible it would be to establish the kind of rapport necessary for meaningful communication. Under such restrictive conditions, the officials were essentially requiring her to conduct spiritual counseling under interrogation conditions, creating an environment that would make genuine dialogue nearly impossible, while protecting themselves from any liability if the session failed to produce results. Deputy Warden Chun added the final layer of bureaucratic complexity with an apologetic expression that didn't quite mask her relief at shifting responsibility to higher authorities. Additionally, sister, you'll need to sign additional security agreements, acknowledging that any information shared during the counseling session becomes part of the federal investigation record. Your normal pastoral confidentiality privileges have been suspended for this particular case due to national security considerations. The requirement represented a fundamental violation of the spiritual counseling relationship, turning what should have been a confidential conversation between a minister and a troubled soul into an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as pastoral care. Sister Maria understood that the officials weren't necessarily trying to be obstructive. They were following protocols designed by people who understood security threats, but had never attempted to provide genuine spiritual guidance to someone whose soul might still be reachable despite their crimes. The break-room conversation died the moment Sister Maria entered, replaced by the awkward silence that seemed to follow religious personnel through secular institutions, like an invisible cloud of discomfort. 3 correctional officers huddled around a coffee machine that had seen better decades, their badges identifying them as part of the maximum security detail that handled the prison's most dangerous inmates. Officer Jake Morrison, whose reputation for handling difficult prisoners had earned him respect throughout the facility, glanced up from his newspaper with barely concealed irritation. "Great," Morrison muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "Here comes the God Squad. Bet she's here to tell us how we need to show more compassion to the psychopath in Cell Block X." His tone carried the dismissive edge that correctional officers reserved for administrators, social workers, and anyone else who dealt with criminals without actually having to control them physically. Officer Lisa Thompson, a 20-year veteran, whose scarred knuckles testified to numerous physical altercations with violent inmates, snorted with amusement as she stirred powdered creamer into her coffee. "What's next, Morrison? Maybe she wants to organize a prayer circle for the guy who tried to blow up half of Europe. I'm sure a few Hail Marys will fix whatever's wrong with him." The third officer, a younger man named Kevin Walsh, whose nervousness around the high security win had become a source of ongoing jokes among his colleagues, attempted to inject a note of diplomatic neutrality into the conversation. "Come on, guys. Sister Maria's not that bad. At least she doesn't file complaints every time we use necessary force to maintain order." Morrison folded his newspaper with theatrical precision and fixed Walsh with the patient stare that senior officers used to educate rookies about institutional realities. "Kid, you've been here, 6 months? Let me explain something about the bleeding hearts who think they can save these animals with kindness and understanding. They show up with their good intentions and their college degrees, spend a few hours talking about feelings and redemption, then go home to their safe neighborhoods while we deal with the reality of what these scumbags are actually capable of." Sister Maria approached the coffee machine with the unhurried patience that had become her trademark, apparently oblivious to the conversation that had been taking place at her expense. Her movements carried the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to functioning in hostile environments, though the officers interpreted her calm demeanor as evidence of naive idealism rather than hard-earned professionalism. "Good morning, officers," she said with genuine warmth, reaching around Thompson to access the coffee supplies. How are you handling the additional security protocols for the new transfer? I imagine the enhanced supervision requirements are making your jobs more difficult. Thompson exchanged a meaningful glance with Morrison before responding with the condescending patience that adults used when explaining obvious facts to children. Sister, with all due respect, security protocols aren't really something you need to worry about. Your job is to sit in a nice safe room and listen to people talk about their feelings. Our job is to make sure they don't kill each other or escape to hurt innocent people. The dismissal was delivered with the casual cruelty that institutional hierarchies bred, where people who dealt with administrative paperwork were considered fundamentally different from those who faced physical dangers. Morrison nodded approvingly at his colleague's explanation, adding his own layer of educational condescension to the conversation. The thing is, sister, guys like this new transfer don't think the way normal people think. They're not confused or misguided or looking for redemption. They're predators who view kindness as weakness and use people's good intentions against them. No offense, but your approach to dealing with troubled souls isn't going to work on someone who spent years perfecting ways to manipulate and destroy other human beings. Walsh, still attempting to maintain some semblance of professional courtesy, tried to soften his colleague's bluntness with what he imagined was helpful advice. What Officer Morrison means, sister, is that maybe you should stick to counseling the inmates who committed normal crimes. You know, robbery, assault, drug dealing. Guys who made bad choices but aren't fundamentally evil. Leave the terrorists and serial killers to people who understand how dangerous they really are. The suggestion was offered with genuine concern, but it carried the implicit assumption that religious personnel lacked the psychological sophistication necessary to comprehend truly malevolent behavior. Sister Maria accepted the advice with gracious humility, nodding as if she was grateful for their protective guidance rather than recognizing it as evidence of their limited understanding of both her capabilities and the complexities of human motivation. I appreciate your concern for my safety, she replied, her tone suggesting sincere gratitude rather than any awareness of being patronized. You're right that some individuals present unique challenges that require special understanding. I suppose my approach is based on the belief that even the most damaged souls retain some capacity for reflection and change. Morrison's laughter was sharp and brief, cutting through the break room's stale air like a blade. Sister, you sound like one of those social workers who thinks childhood trauma excuses mass murder. This guy didn't become a terrorist because he had a difficult upbringing. He became a terrorist because he enjoys causing pain and terror. There's no therapy or prayer that's going to fix that kind of fundamental evil. The conversation continued around her as Sister Maria prepared her coffee with methodical precision, her apparent absorption in the simple task masking her analysis of the officers' psychological profiles and operational mindsets. They saw her as they had been trained to see religious personnel in institutional settings, well-meaning but naive, emotionally driven rather than analytically rigorous, operating from idealistic theories rather than practical experience with genuine human evil. What they couldn't recognize was the way her questions about security protocols revealed familiarity with operational planning, or how her calm acceptance of their warnings demonstrated the confidence of someone who had faced far more dangerous individuals under far more challenging circumstances. They interpreted her humility as evidence of inexperience, rather than understanding it as the professional discipline of someone whose effectiveness depended on being consistently underestimated by both colleagues and adversaries. Sister Maria's modest apartment occupied the third floor of a converted brownstone 6 blocks from Blackwater Federal Penitentiary, its windows offering a view of the industrial district where smokestacks and water towers created a skyline that spoke of working class endurance rather than aspiration. The building's other tenants knew her as a quiet woman who kept regular hours and never complained about the aging plumbing or the radiators that clanged through winter nights like imprisoned spirits. To the elderly widow downstairs and the young family across the hall, she was simply another tenant paying rent on time and maintaining the kind of respectful distance that urban anonymity required. The apartment's front room had been arranged to support her cover identity with careful attention to authentic detail. Religious texts lined simple wooden shelves alongside books on grief counseling and addiction recovery that any prison chaplain might reasonably possess. A small desk held correspondence with various charitable organizations and prison ministry programs, documenting the kinds of professional relationships that defined her official life. Photographs displayed scenes of volunteer work at homeless shelters and community food banks, creating a visual narrative of someone whose calling centered on service to society's forgotten populations. But the bedroom told a different story too. Anyone who possessed the knowledge necessary to interpret what they were seeing. The mattress rested on a platform bed that had been modified with hidden compartments, accessible through panels that looked like decorative molding. Inside these spaces, wrapped in moisture-proof containers, lay items that no prison chaplain would need or know how to use effectively. Medical supplies that went far beyond basic first aid included surgical instruments, designed for field conditions, and pharmaceutical compounds that weren't available through civilian channels. The apartment's bathroom medicine cabinet contained bottles labeled with common over-the-counter medications, but careful examination would have revealed that several containers held capsules that didn't match their labels. Anti-anxiety medication bottles contained stimulants that could enhance alertness and reaction time during high-stress situations. Sleep aids had been replaced with compounds that could induce temporary memory disruption in someone who ingested them unknowingly. Pain relievers shared space with substances that could cause disorientation or unconsciousness when administered in precise dosages. A jewelry box on the dresser held a simple silver cross on a chain that appeared to be standard religious ornamentation. However, the cross's vertical element could be unscrewed to reveal a titanium blade sharp enough to cut through plastic restraints or clothing. The chain itself was constructed from microcables strong enough to support human body weight, disguised as ordinary decorative links. These weren't the accessories of someone whose greatest danger came from counseling troubled souls in secured environments. The apartment's small kitchen had been outfitted with appliances that served dual purposes beyond their obvious culinary functions. A coffee grinder could reduce various organic materials into powders that would dissolve invisibly in liquids. The food processor's blades had been replaced with components that could handle materials considerably harder than vegetables or meat. Spice containers held substances that would have interested law enforcement agencies had they known to test their contents, though each appeared to contain exactly what its label indicated to casual observation. Sister Maria's evening routine included practices that had nothing to do with religious devotion or spiritual preparation. She spent 30 minutes each night maintaining physical conditioning through exercises designed to preserve strength, flexibility, and reaction time despite the sedentary nature of her cover occupation. The movements were performed silently and required no equipment, but they followed patterns developed for operatives who needed to maintain combat readiness while living under civilian cover for extended periods. Her study habits involved materials that weren't available in any seminary or divinity school curriculum. Technical manuals had been disguised as theological texts through careful rebinding and the addition of religious dust jackets. A book that appeared to contain biblical commentary actually provided detailed information about chemical compounds and their effects on human behavior. Another text that looked like a guide to pastoral counseling contained psychological manipulation, techniques that went far beyond anything taught in legitimate therapy programs. The apartment's communication capabilities reflected needs that extended beyond coordinating prison ministry activities. A radio that appeared to be a simple device for listening to religious programming had been modified to receive encrypted transmissions on frequencies that weren't used by commercial broadcasters. The frequencies themselves changed according to patterns that required specialized knowledge to follow, ensuring that casual listeners would encounter only static or ordinary radio programming, computer equipment that seemed appropriate for someone who needed to maintain correspondence with charitable organizations and prepare counseling session reports. Actually contained software that could analyze behavioral patterns and psychological profiles with sophistication that rivaled government intelligence systems. The programs were disguised as word processing applications and email clients, but they provided capabilities that would have been valuable to interrogators working with high-value targets. Documentation hidden within religious texts included psychological profiles of international terrorists and criminal organization leaders that contained information not available through public sources. The files were written in languages that most people couldn't read and used terminology that required specialized training to understand, but they provided insights into the minds and motivations of individuals who operated at the highest levels of international criminal activity. Perhaps most significantly, the apartment contained no photographs or personal mementos that predated her current identity as Sister Maria. No family pictures, no souvenirs from previous travels, no documentation of friendships or relationships that existed before she assumed her religious cover. Her personal history appeared to begin with her arrival at the apartment 3 years earlier, as if the woman who now carried rosary beads had emerged fully formed without any previous existence to complicate her current narrative. The maximum security wing of Blackwater Federal Penitentiary existed in a state of perpetual artificial twilight, where fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between reinforced concrete walls that had been designed to contain the worst humanity had to offer. Sister Maria walked beside Officer Morrison through corridors lined with cells that housed murderers, rapists, and domestic terrorists, each secured behind steel doors that featured only small observation windows and food slots that could be opened from the outside. The air carried the distinctive institutional smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with the deeper odors of fear, anger, and desperation that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. "Last chance to reconsider, Sister," Morrison said as they approached the isolation wing where the newest high-security transfer was being held. His tone carried genuine concern rather than his earlier dismissiveness, as if proximity to their destination had reminded him of the real dangers involved in the upcoming encounter. "This guy isn't like the other inmates you counsel. The preliminary psych evaluation suggests he's completely unresponsive to normal social interaction patterns." Sister Maria nodded with the serene acceptance that had become her trademark, but her peripheral vision was already cataloging details that spoke to her former training. The corridor's camera placement revealed blind spots that could be exploited by someone with sufficient knowledge of surveillance systems. Emergency exits were clearly marked but secured with electronic locks that would require specific codes to operate during a lockdown situation. The guards' positioning and movement patterns followed protocols that were predictable enough to be manipulated by anyone who understood institutional security procedures. "I appreciate your concern, Officer Morrison," she replied, her voice carrying the calm confidence that inmates and staff had learned to associate with her presence. "But I believe that every soul deserves the opportunity for spiritual guidance, regardless of their crimes or their apparent responsiveness to conventional approaches." The isolation wing consisted of 12 cells arranged in a U-shaped configuration that allowed constant observation from a central guard station, equipped with multiple monitor screens and communication equipment. Each cell was designed to prevent any meaningful interaction between inmates, with walls thick enough to muffle sound and windows positioned to eliminate sightlines between adjacent units. The environment had been engineered to create maximum psychological pressure through enforced solitude and sensory deprivation. Cell Number 7, housed the man that intelligence agencies had been hunting for over a decade. Through the reinforced glass window, Sister Maria could see a figure seated on the narrow metal bench that served as both chair and bed in the Spartan accommodation. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with dark hair and olive skin that suggested Mediterranean or Middle Eastern heritage. His posture was erect but relaxed, suggesting someone who had learned to maintain dignity and composure despite degrading circumstances. "That's him," Morrison said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might somehow attract the attention of the man behind the reinforced barriers. "Real name supposedly Khalil Rashid, but intelligence agencies think that's just another false identity. They've been calling him the Shadow because he managed to disappear and reappear across 3 continents without leaving traces that normal investigative methods could follow." Sister Maria studied the figure through the observation window with the careful attention that she brought to all her counseling subjects, but her analysis was informed by knowledge that went far beyond standard pastoral care training. The man's positioning within the cell maximized his ability to observe approaches while maintaining distance from potential attack vectors. His clothing had been arranged to allow freedom of movement while concealing his physical condition from observers. His breathing pattern suggested meditation techniques designed to maintain psychological equilibrium under stress. "Has he spoken to anyone since his arrival?" she asked, though her tone suggested routine professional interest, rather than recognition of the significance behind the question. Morrison consulted a clipboard that contained the previous day's incident. Reports and behavioral observations. Not a word. Refused food for the first 18 hours, then ate only after they explained the consequences of hunger striking. Won't acknowledge medical personnel, legal representatives, or interrogation specialists. Just sits there like he's waiting for something. The preliminary briefing had described classic counter-interrogation behavior, but Sister Maria recognized patterns that suggested training beyond what most terrorist organizations provided to their operatives. The subject's responses indicated familiarity with institutional psychology and resistance techniques that were typically associated with state-sponsored intelligence operations rather than religious extremist movements. "I'd like to begin with a simple introduction," Sister Maria said, approaching the cell door with the unhurried confidence that had become her professional signature. Sometimes establishing basic human contact can create openings for more meaningful dialogue. Morrison moved to the intercom system that would allow communication through the cell's speaker system. But before he could activate the connection, an alarm began sounding throughout the maximum security wing. Emergency lights flashed red as the facility's automated systems announced a medical emergency in the administrative section. The alarm's piercing wail echoed off concrete walls while staff members could be heard, responding to crisis protocols that required immediate attention. Through the chaos of emergency response, Sister Maria heard something that made her blood freeze. Over the facility's communication system, someone was reporting that Deputy Warden Chen had collapsed in her office, apparently suffering from some kind of poisoning or chemical exposure. Medical personnel were being summoned, but initial reports suggested symptoms consistent with exposure to compounds that weren't typically available within prison environments. In that moment, Sister Maria's training overcame her cover identity. Her eyes snapped to the observation window where Khalil Rashid was watching the unfolding emergency with an expression of calm satisfaction that confirmed her worst suspicions. The timing wasn't coincidental. The symptoms being described matched specific chemical agents that she had encountered during operations, targeting terrorist cells that specialized in assassination and targeted elimination. "Officer Morrison," she said, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been present moments earlier, "you need to evacuate this wing immediately and initiate full chemical contamination protocols. This isn't a random medical emergency." "Morrison," stared at her with confusion that quickly shifted to alarm as he recognized that the quiet nun was speaking with the confident precision of someone who understood exactly what was happening and why. "Sister, what are you talking about? How could you possibly know what kind of emergency this is?" But Sister Maria was already moving with the focused efficiency of someone whose survival instincts had been activated by recognition of immediate danger. Her apparent spiritual calling had just collided with operational realities that threatened to expose everything she had worked to conceal. And the terrorist behind the reinforced glass was watching her response with the calculating interest of someone who had just confirmed suspicions of his own. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The silence that followed Morrison's confused question stretched between them like a wire under tension, broken only by the distant sounds of medical personnel responding to the emergency in the administrative wing. Sister Maria found herself trapped between the necessity of maintaining her cover and the professional instinct that screamed warnings about chemical agents and coordinated attacks. But it was the soft sound of slow, deliberate clapping that drew her attention back to the observation window. Khalil Rashid was applauding with the measured rhythm of someone acknowledging a particularly skillful performance. His dark eyes held an expression of genuine appreciation mixed with something that might have been amusement, as if he had just witnessed the solution to a puzzle that had been entertaining him for some time. When he spoke, his voice carried through the intercom with the cultured accent of someone educated in multiple countries and languages. "Impressive reaction time, sister," he said, emphasizing her religious title with just enough irony to make it clear that he understood exactly what kind of masquerade he was witnessing. Most people would have assumed Deputy Warden Chen was having a heart attack or stroke. But you immediately recognized symptoms of oleander alkaloid poisoning, didn't you? Morrison's hand froze over the alarm controls as the implications of what he was hearing began to penetrate his confusion. His eyes darted between the composed terrorist and the nun whose calm demeanor had shifted into something that looked distinctly professional rather than pastoral. "Sister, what's he talking about? How would you know anything about poison symptoms?" But Sister Maria's attention was focused entirely on the man behind the reinforced glass, whose knowing smile confirmed that her carefully constructed cover had just been compromised by someone who possessed the expertise to recognize professional competence when he saw it. The emergency she had responded to wasn't a coincidental medical crisis. It was a test designed to provoke exactly the kind of reaction that would reveal her true background to someone trained to identify intelligence operatives. "The oleander extract was quite dilute," Khalil continued conversationally, as if discussing weather conditions rather than attempted murder. "Deputy Warden Chen will experience nausea and disorientation for several hours, but nothing life-threatening. I needed to observe how different staff members would respond to symptoms of exotic chemical exposure. Your reaction was quite educational." The casual admission of responsibility for Chun's condition hit Morrison like a physical blow. But what seemed to disturb him more was the growing realization that the quiet nun he had been escorting possessed knowledge that no religious counselor should have. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio to call for backup, but Sister Maria's gentle touch on his arm stopped him with surprising firmness. "Officer Morrison," she said quietly, "call in additional security right now would only create more targets for someone who has already demonstrated the ability to introduce chemical agents into a secure facility. We need to think this through carefully." Her tactical assessment revealed training that went far beyond anything taught in seminary programs, and Khalil's appreciative nod confirmed that he was evaluating her responses with the professional interest of someone who understood exactly what kind of skills she was displaying. The pretense of spiritual counseling had evaporated, replaced by the careful dance of recognition between two people whose expertise existed in realms that most civilians couldn't comprehend. You're quite right about tactical priorities, Khalil sighed, settling back against the cell wall with the relaxed confidence of someone who held all the advantages in the current situation. Though I must admit, your cover identity is exceptionally well constructed. The psychological profiles, the documented charitable work, the authentic religious training. Someone invested considerable resources in creating Sister Maria Elena Vasquez. The use of her full assumed name carried implications that made Sister Maria's blood run cold. If he knew details that weren't included in her official documentation, then he possessed intelligence resources that extended far beyond what terrorist organizations typically commanded. The depth of his knowledge suggested connections to state-sponsored intelligence services or criminal networks with capabilities that matched government agencies. I'm particularly impressed by your linguistic skills, he continued, switching effortlessly to Arabic with the fluency of a native speaker. Your Damascene dialect is quite authentic, though I detect traces of training rather than childhood acquisition. Military intelligence language schools have very distinctive pedagogical fingerprints for those who know what to listen for. Morrison was staring at both of them with the growing horror of someone who had stumbled into a conversation that was far beyond his understanding or training. The casual display of linguistic expertise and the evident mutual recognition between the terrorist and the nun had transformed what should have been a routine spiritual counseling session into something that felt like a briefing between enemy intelligence operatives. Sister, Morrison said, his voice cracking slightly under the stress of trying to process information that contradicted everything he thought. He knew about institutional security and the people he worked with daily. What the hell is going on here? How does he know about your language training? Why are you talking like you understand chemical weapons? Sister Maria turned to face the correctional officer whose simple world of rules and procedures had just collapsed into a reality where terrorists could poison administrators with exotic plant extracts and nuns possessed knowledge of tactical assessment and counterintelligence operations. Her expression carried the gentle patience she had always shown him, but now it was colored with something that looked like regret for the innocence he was about to lose. Officer Morrison, she said softly, sometimes the most important conversations happen between people who understand each other in ways that transcend their official roles. I think Mr. Rashid and I need to have that kind of conversation. Khalil's laughter was quiet, but genuinely amused, as if he was appreciating the elegant way she had just acknowledged their mutual recognition, while maintaining plausible deniability about the specific nature of their respective backgrounds. The sound carried through the intercom with the warmth of someone who had found an unexpected intellectual equal in circumstances neither of them had anticipated. The heavy footsteps echoing through the maximum security corridor announced the arrival of Warden Patricia Hawkins before she came into view, her 30-year career in federal corrections evident in the way she moved through crisis situations with calm authority that demanded immediate attention from everyone in her vicinity. Behind her walked FBI agent Marcus Webb, whose earlier bureaucratic concerns about protocol and procedure had been replaced by the grim focus of someone dealing with an active threat to federal facility security. Morrison, step away from that. Cell immediately, Hawkins ordered, her voice carrying the kind of command presence that ended discussions before they could begin. We've got a situation that's escalated beyond standard correctional protocols, and I need everyone to follow my instructions without question or delay. The warden's arrival had an immediate effect on the dynamics of the situation, transforming what had been an increasingly dangerous conversation between Sister Maria and Khalil Rashid into a tactical briefing where institutional hierarchy reasserted itself over the psychological chess match that had been developing between the two professionals. Morrison gratefully stepped back from the intercom controls, clearly relieved to have someone with higher authority take responsibility for decisions that had moved far beyond his training or comfort level. Agent Webb has just informed me that our chemical analysis of Deputy Warden Chun's symptoms confirms exposure to a cardiac glycoside compound that's consistent with processed oleander alkaloids. Hawkins continued, her eyes moving between Sister Maria and the observation window where Khalil remained seated with apparent unconcern about the emergency response his actions had triggered. That's not something that accidentally finds its way into a maximum security federal prison. Agent Webb stepped forward with the focused intensity of someone whose earlier assumptions about manageable threats had just been proven dangerously inadequate. His briefcase contained additional documentation that he consulted while addressing the group with the urgent precision of someone delivering a tactical update rather than a routine security briefing. Sister Maria, he said, using her religious title but with an undertone that suggested he was beginning to question whether that designation accurately reflected her actual capabilities. We need to discuss your qualifications for handling this particular counseling situation. The subject's behavior since your arrival suggests he's been expecting someone with your specific background. The observation was delivered as a request for information, but Sister Maria recognized it as an interrogation technique designed to prompt her into revealing knowledge that would confirm or deny suspicions about her true identity. The federal agents had clearly been analyzing the conversation they had monitored, and their tactical assessment was leading them toward conclusions about her background that could compromise her cover permanently. Agent Webb, she replied with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the crisis. I'm not sure what you mean by specific background. My training in pastoral counseling has included exposure to various psychological manipulation techniques that some criminals use to maintain control over their environments. But Warden Hawkins was studying Sister Maria with the calculating assessment of someone whose decades of experience had taught her to recognize when inmates and staff weren't being entirely truthful about their capabilities or motivations. Her next words cut through the diplomatic language with the directness of someone who had no time for bureaucratic niceties. Sister, in the past 20 minutes, you've demonstrated knowledge of chemical weapons symptomology, tactical threat assessment, and crisis response protocols that go considerably beyond anything taught in seminary programs. Either you're the most remarkably well-educated chaplain in the federal system, or you've got training that isn't reflected in your personnel file. The direct confrontation forced Sister Maria into a decision point that she had been hoping to avoid. Maintaining her cover would require continuing to deflect questions about her expertise, but the escalating security crisis meant that pretending ignorance could result in additional casualties if Khalil had prepared other surprises beyond the oleander poisoning. Her professional obligations were colliding with her operational security in ways that made maintaining her false identity increasingly untenable. Warden Hawkins, she said carefully, there are aspects of my background that aren't included in standard documentation for reasons related to personnel security. If you're asking whether I have experience dealing with individuals who pose unconventional threats to institutional safety, then yes, I do. Agent Webb's expression shifted as he processed the implications of her careful admission. His earlier concerns about protocol being replaced by recognition that they might be dealing with someone whose capabilities could prove valuable in managing the current crisis. He consulted his tablet before responding with the focused attention of someone whose priorities had just been dramatically reordered. Sister, we're not dealing with a routine prison ministry situation anymore. Subject has demonstrated ability to introduce chemical agents into a secure federal facility, which suggests planning and resources that extend far beyond individual terrorist capabilities. We need to know exactly what kind of training and experience you bring to this situation. Warden Hawkins stepped closer to the observation window where Khalil was listening to their conversation with evident satisfaction, as if the unfolding recognition of Sister Maria's true background was providing exactly the kind of entertainment he had been expecting. Her next words were addressed to the group, but spoken loudly enough for the intercom to carry them into the cell. All right, people, here's what we're going to do. The previous security protocols for this counseling session are suspended effective immediately. Sister Maria, whatever your actual qualifications might be, you now have my full authorization to conduct this interview using whatever methods you deem necessary to assess the threat level this subject represents to my facility and my staff. The authorization represented a complete reversal of the earlier bureaucratic restrictions, transforming Sister Maria from a supplicant requesting permission to perform basic pastoral duties into a federal asset with broad operational latitude to handle an active security threat. Khalil's approving nod suggested that this development had been exactly what he had been maneuvering to achieve. Through his carefully calculated provocation, Sister Maria approached the cell door with movements that had shed every trace of religious humility, her posture now carrying the confident precision of someone who had conducted high-stakes interrogations in environments far more dangerous than federal prison cells. The transformation was so complete that Morrison found himself questioning whether he had ever actually seen the real woman beneath the carefully constructed persona that had been operating within Blackwater's walls for 3 years. "Mr. Rashid," she said, activating the intercom with the casual familiarity of someone who had used similar communication systems in context where a single mistake could compromise national security operations. "Or should I address you by one of your other documented identities? Intelligence files contain at least 17 different names you've used across 4 continents, though I suspect the actual number is considerably higher." Khalil's eyebrows raised with genuine appreciation as he recognized that the conversation had shifted into territory where his opponent possessed detailed knowledge that went far beyond anything available through standard law enforcement databases. His response carried the professional courtesy that existed between adversaries who had operated in similar circles and understood the complexities of each other's work. "I think Khalil will suffice for our purposes," he replied, settling into a position that suggested he was preparing for an extended conversation with someone whose capabilities had finally been properly revealed. "Though I must admit, I'm curious about which intelligence service compiled those files. The quality of documentation varies considerably between agencies." Sister Maria positioned herself where she could maintain eye contact while keeping her peripheral vision clear for potential threats, a tactical stance that Agent Webb recognized from his own training but had never seen demonstrated by religious personnel. Her next words were delivered with the clinical precision of someone conducting a professional assessment rather than a spiritual counseling session. "The chemical agent you used on Deputy Warden Chen was derived from Nerium oleander processed through a technique that preserves the cardiac glycosides while eliminating most of the bitter taste that would make detection likely. That's not information available through internet research or standard chemistry textbooks. It requires training from specialists who understand how to weaponize botanical compounds for covert operations." The technical analysis demonstrated expertise that made Agent Webb reach for his secure phone to contact superiors who needed to know that their routine terrorist custody situation had just become something far more complex. Warden Hawkins was staring at Sister Maria with the fascination of someone watching a magic trick where the familiar suddenly revealed itself to be completely different from what she had believed. The timing of Chun's exposure was calculated to occur exactly 90 minutes after your arrival in the maximum security wing. Sister Maria continued, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone presenting facts rather than theories. "That suggests you had advanced knowledge of facility schedules and staff assignments that couldn't have been obtained through casual observation. Someone provided you with inside information about prison operations." Khalil's expression shifted from amusement to genuine respect as he realized that his opponent was conducting a real-time intelligence assessment that was uncovering operational details he had assumed were secure. His response carried the cautious tone of someone who had underestimated an adversary and was rapidly recalculating the strategic balance of their interaction. "You're suggesting I have confederates within the prison administration," he said carefully, testing whether she was making educated guesses or working from specific intelligence that could compromise his remaining assets. That would be a serious accusation requiring substantial evidence to support. Sister Maria activated the intercom's recording function with movements that demonstrated familiarity with surveillance equipment that went beyond basic institutional training. Her next statement was directed as much toward the federal agents, listening as toward the man behind the reinforced glass. The oleander alkaloids were introduced through the ventilation system serving Chin's office, which requires access to building schematics and mechanical spaces that aren't available to normal personnel. The compound was delivered using an aerosol dispersal method that suggests military-grade equipment rather than improvised terrorist techniques. Most significantly, the timing required coordination with someone who could monitor Chin's movements and confirm she would be in her office during the exposure window. The technical breakdown revealed knowledge of chemical weapons, delivery systems, and operational planning that transformed the entire nature of the threat they were dealing with. Agent Webb was speaking rapidly into his secure phone, updating federal response teams about a situation that had evolved from a routine custody transfer into an active counterintelligence operation involving unknown numbers of compromised personnel. Additionally, Sister Maria continued, her analysis gaining momentum as she applied techniques that had been refined through years of extracting information from high-value targets. Your behavioral patterns since arrival suggest you're operating under specific instructions to maintain communication security while gathering intelligence about facility operations. This isn't random terrorist activity. It's reconnaissance for a larger operation. Khalil was no longer smiling. The woman who had appeared to be a simple prison chaplain was demonstrating analytical capabilities that matched or exceeded those of senior intelligence officials, and her assessment was uncovering operational elements that he had believed were completely secure. His silence was more telling than any verbal response could have been. "The question," Sister Maria said, her voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who had successfully maneuvered an adversary into a psychological corner, "is whether you're going to cooperate in identifying your confederates before they implement whatever you've been gathering intelligence to support, or whether you're going to maintain operational discipline until people start dying." Morrison was pressed against the corridor wall, overwhelmed by watching someone he had thought he knew completely demolish the psychological defenses of a terrorist that federal interrogation specialists had been unable to crack. The nun who had quietly counseled petty criminals for 3 years had just revealed herself to be an intelligence operative whose expertise matched the most dangerous threats the federal system was designed to contain. The secure communication device that Agent Webb had been using suddenly erupted with urgent chatter from federal response teams positioned around the prison perimeter, their voices carrying the controlled tension of tactical units reporting developments that transformed the current crisis from a contained facility threat into something far more dangerous. Sister Maria recognized the communication patterns from operations where initial intelligence had proven catastrophically incomplete, leading to rapid escalation of tactical responses and resource deployment. "Agent Webb, we have multiple vehicles approaching the facility perimeter from 3 different vectors," came the report through his encrypted radio. "Surveillance indicates at least 12 armed individuals in tactical gear, moving with military precision toward predetermined positions around the prison complex. This appears to be a coordinated external assault designed to coincide with internal disruption." Warden Hawkins felt the blood drain from her face as she realized that Khalil's chemical attack on Deputy Warden Chun hadn't been an isolated incident of prisoner violence, but rather the opening move in a sophisticated operation designed to compromise facility security from multiple directions simultaneously. Her 30 years of corrections experience had prepared her for riots, escape attempts, and individual acts of violence, but not for coordinated military-style assaults involving external strike teams and internal sabotage. The intelligence Chun was gathering wasn't just about facility operations, Sister Maria said, her voice carrying the grim certainty of someone who had seen similar tactical patterns in operational contexts where underestimating enemy capabilities led to catastrophic casualties. He needed detailed information about guard rotations, security protocols, and architectural vulnerabilities to coordinate an external extraction operation with maximum probability of success. Khalil's expression had shifted from amused satisfaction to focused concentration as he monitored the developing situation through the corridor's emergency communication systems. His earlier psychological game-playing had been replaced by the operational discipline of someone whose carefully planned mission was entering its most critical phase, where timing and coordination would determine whether months of preparation resulted in success or disaster. "Sister," Agent Webb said, his voice tight with the stress of managing a rapidly evolving threat that had moved far beyond normal federal law enforcement capabilities. "If you have experience with counter-terrorism operations, we need that expertise right now. This facility wasn't designed to withstand coordinated military assault, and we've got over 3,000 inmates who could become casualties if those external teams breach our perimeter." The magnitude of potential civilian casualties forced Sister Maria into a decision point she had been hoping to avoid for the past 3 years. Maintaining her carefully constructed cover identity would mean allowing federal security personnel to handle a threat they weren't equipped to counter effectively, potentially resulting in mass casualties among both staff and inmates. But revealing her true capabilities would expose operational secrets that could compromise other intelligence assets and destroy the quiet life she had built through enormous personal sacrifice. "The external assault teams will attempt to breach the facility through ventilation systems and service tunnels that bypass main security checkpoints," she said, her analysis drawing on knowledge of facility penetration techniques that weren't taught in standard law enforcement training programs. "Their objective isn't random violence. They're conducting a precision extraction operation designed to retrieve Khalil with minimal collateral damage to infrastructure they might need for future operations." Agent Webb was coordinating with federal tactical response teams through his secure communications while trying to process intelligence assessments that revealed capabilities he hadn't known existed within the prison's personnel roster. His earlier concerns about protocol and jurisdiction had been replaced by recognition that they were facing threats that required expertise beyond anything available through normal federal law enforcement channels. The timing suggests they're operating under constraints that require completion of the extraction within a specific window. Sister Maria continued, her tactical assessment gaining urgency as she recognized patterns that indicated immediate escalation of violence levels. If the external teams encounter unexpected resistance, or if their timeline is disrupted, they'll shift from precision extraction to destruction of evidence, which means eliminating witnesses and creating enough chaos to cover their withdrawal. The clinical precision of her threat assessment made clear that she understood not just the technical aspects of the assault, but the psychological profile of operatives who would sacrifice civilian lives to protect operational security. Warden Hawkins was staring at Sister Maria with the growing realization that the quiet nun who had counseled troubled inmates possessed knowledge of terrorist tactics that matched government counter-terrorism specialists. "How long do we have before they initiate the breach?" Agent Webb asked, his question revealing that he had accepted Sister Maria's analysis as authoritative, despite having no official confirmation of her qualifications to make such assessments. Sister Maria checked the emergency communication displays that showed tactical teams repositioning around the facility perimeter, her evaluation informed by operational experience with similar extractions that had been conducted under comparable time pressures. Based on their positioning and the equipment signatures your surveillance teams are reporting, they'll begin coordinated penetration in approximately 27 minutes. Once they breach containment, we'll have less than 15 minutes before they're in position to extract Khalil or implement destruction protocols. The specific timeline carried implications that forced everyone present to confront the reality that their current security measures were inadequate to prevent either outcome. Khalil's satisfied expression confirmed that the operation was proceeding according to plan, and his earlier psychological maneuvering had been designed to ensure that key facility personnel would be concentrated in the maximum security wing. When the external assault commenced, Morrison was pressed against the corridor wall, overwhelmed by the transformation of his familiar workplace into the target of military-style operations that seemed to belong in international conflict zones rather than domestic federal corrections. The nun who had quietly performed spiritual counseling for 3 years had just revealed herself to be someone whose expertise might be the only thing standing between his colleagues and a coordinated terrorist assault designed to free the most dangerous criminal in federal custody. Sister Maria turned away from the observation window and faced Agent Webb with the calm resolution of someone who had already calculated the personal cost of the decision she was about to make. Her voice carried none of the uncertainty that had characterized her earlier responses, replaced instead by the authoritative precision of someone whose operational expertise was about to be fully deployed regardless of the consequences to her carefully constructed civilian identity. Agent Webb, I need you to contact Colonel Patricia Santos at Fort Meade and tell her that Operation Nightingale requires immediate tactical support, she said, using code words that would identify her to intelligence networks that officially didn't exist. Tell her that Maria Vasquez is requesting priority asset deployment to counter a coordinated extraction operation targeting a high-value prisoner. The specific nature of her instructions, delivered with the confident expectation that they would be understood and acted upon immediately, made clear that Sister Maria possessed connections to intelligence operations at levels that extended far beyond anything Webb had previously encountered in domestic law enforcement contexts. His expression shifted from confusion to recognition as he realized that the quiet nun was revealing access to resources that could fundamentally alter the tactical balance of their current crisis. Colonel Santos will coordinate air support and specialized tactical teams that can neutralize the external assault force, Sister Maria continued, her operational planning drawing on expertise that had been refined through years of managing similar crises in international contexts. But the extraction timeline means we can't wait for federal reinforcements to arrive. We need to disrupt their coordination immediately, and that requires direct action against their communications infrastructure. Warden Hawkins watched with growing amazement as Sister Maria transformed from a religious counselor into someone whose operational authority seemed to supersede normal chains of command and jurisdictional limitations. The casual manner in which she was coordinating federal military response suggested relationships and capabilities that existed outside standard government bureaucracy. The external teams are communicating through encrypted radio frequencies that can be disrupted using electronic warfare techniques, Sister Maria explained, her tactical assessment revealing knowledge of signals intelligence that wasn't available through civilian training programs. But implementing effective jamming requires someone to physically access their communications equipment, which means penetrating their perimeter positions. Agent Webb was speaking rapidly into his secure phone, relaying Sister Maria's coded messages to contacts, whose response times would determine whether the developing crisis could be contained before it escalated into the kind of mass casualty event that would dominate international headlines. His earlier skepticism about her qualifications had been replaced by urgent cooperation with someone whose expertise might represent their only viable option for preventing disaster. I'll handle the communications disruption personally, Sister Maria said, her words carrying the finality of someone whose decision had already been made, despite the obvious personal risks involved. My operational training includes infiltration, techniques that will allow me to reach their equipment positions without triggering defensive responses. The casual reference to infiltration capabilities revealed the true extent of skills that had been concealed beneath her religious persona for 3 years. Morrison was staring at her with the fascination of someone watching a complete stranger emerge from within a person he had thought he knew completely, as if the nun who had counseled troubled inmates had been an elaborate disguise worn by someone whose real expertise lay in operations that most people couldn't imagine. Sister, what you're suggesting is essentially a solo assault on entrenched tactical positions, Agent Webb said, his professional assessment of the proposed operation revealing deep concern about survival odds that approached statistical impossibility. Even with your apparent training, the probability of successfully penetrating multiple defensive positions and sabotaging their communications equipment without getting killed is essentially zero. Sister Maria smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent years avoiding exactly this kind of exposure, but whose commitment to protecting innocent lives had finally forced her to abandon the safety of anonymity. Her response carried the calm acceptance of someone whose personal sacrifices had always been secondary to operational objectives. Agent Webb, 3 years ago I chose to disappear from a world where those kinds of missions were routine, she said, her voice reflecting both regret for the life she was abandoning and determination to honor commitments that transcended personal safety. But some promises don't come with expiration dates, and some situations require people to do what they're capable of doing, regardless of the personal cost. The sound of explosions from the prison's outer perimeter announced that the external assault had begun ahead of schedule, forcing immediate tactical decisions that would determine whether their hastily coordinated response could prevent the kind of coordinated terrorist operation that would reshape domestic security protocols permanently. Through the facility's emergency communication systems, reports were coming in of breached defensive positions and casualties among federal security personnel. Khalil had risen from his bench and was watching the developing operation with the satisfied expression of someone whose carefully planned mission was proceeding according to expectations. His earlier psychological maneuvering had successfully concentrated key facility personnel in the maximum security wing, creating optimal conditions for the extraction operation that was now entering its final phase. Sister Maria removed her religious habit with the systematic efficiency of someone shedding an identity that had served its purpose, revealing tactical clothing that had been concealed beneath the simple religious garments. The transformation was so complete that she seemed to become an entirely different person, someone whose expertise belonged in operational contexts where failure meant death and success required capabilities that existed far beyond normal human limitations. Tell Colonel Santos that Maria Vasquez is going back to work, she said, disappearing into the chaos of emergency response with the purposeful stride of someone whose quiet retirement had just ended forever. Behind her, Khalil's approving nod suggested that he had finally encountered an adversary whose capabilities matched his own, and that the carefully planned extraction operation was about to face opposition that its planners had never anticipated. 23 minutes later, the external assault teams found their communications completely dead, their extraction helicopters grounded by precision strikes from federal air support, and their carefully planned operation collapsing into chaos they couldn't control or understand. Sister Maria had moved through their perimeter positions like a ghost, disabling equipment with surgical precision while avoiding detection by operatives who had never encountered someone with her particular combination of skills and determination. When the smoke cleared, 12 international terrorists were in federal custody, their sophisticated extraction operation reduced to a case study in how superior planning could be defeated by a single individual who possessed the right expertise and the willingness to use it. when innocent lives hung in the balance. Khalil Rashid remained in his cell, but his expression had shifted from satisfied confidence to genuine respect for an adversary whose capabilities had exceeded even his carefully researched expectations. The man who had orchestrated attacks across 3 continents had been outmaneuvered by a woman whose existence he had never suspected until she had chosen to reveal herself. 3 days later, the woman who had been Sister Maria Elena Vasquez disappeared as completely as if she had never existed. Her apartment was empty, her documentation had been quietly removed from official records, and the inmates who had been counseled by the gentle nun found themselves wondering if they had imagined her entirely. But Officer Morrison kept a photograph. On his desk, a group picture from the prison's annual charity drive, where a quiet woman in religious habit stood among the volunteers, her eyes holding secrets that he was only beginning to understand. Sometimes the most extraordinary people hide in the most ordinary places, waiting for the moment when their true calling demands they step out of the shadows and into the light. If this story captivated you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of viewers who love tales of hidden heroes and extraordinary courage. What story should we tell next? Let us know in the comments below.